Thank you so much, and greetings from Zambia. It's a real honor and privilege to be with you today virtually. I will just share my screen. I hope you're all able to see the PowerPoint. Wonderful. Well, thank you again, once again. It's an honor to be here. And thank you for the good introduction. As mentioned, I am a human rights lawyer from the UK and Zambia. And I also co-founded Advocate, an organization in Sierra Leone that works just with women in detention. I also worked with UNODC and helped to produce a toolkit on gender-responsive non-custodial measures for women. So today I'll be sharing some of that guidance from the toolkit, as well as our work from Sierra Leone. So firstly, the question, I guess, for us to ask is why we should consider non-custodial measures for women. And this is becoming a much more urgent question because the number of women in prison is increasing globally. The number of women increased by 53% since 2000 compared to the male prison population, which increased by 20%. So there's at least 741,000 women in prison across the world, and that number continues to grow. And we know that imprisonment does not address the underlying causes of women's incarceration, which is mainly poverty. So most women will commit an offense because of survival-related causes, such as theft or prostitution. Gender-based violence is a significant factor in the reasons for women either committing an offense, and this has been documented in many research studies. And drug-related offences is also a big factor. So 35% of women are imprisoned globally for drug-related offences compared to 19% for men. And again, the factors of poverty, trauma, and abuse really are the factors behind women being involved in drug-related offences. And they're mostly involved in very low-level offences. They're not really the big players in the drug trade. And last year, my organization Advocate interviewed over 86% of women who are imprisoned in Sierra Leone. And we really found that these key factors were the main ones for women being imprisoned in Sierra Leone. So gender-based violence, poverty, and discriminatory laws. For example, 72% of women had suffered one form of abuse, either from a partner or a spouse before entering prison. And 34% had been arrested or detained for survival or economic petty crimes. And we know that imprisonment negatively impacts women and indeed society. Safety is a key concern. We know that women are more disproportionately affected in prison by sexual abuse and exploitation than male prisoners. Imprisonment can have a traumatic impact on children who are separated from their mothers. And at least 19,000 children are imprisoned globally with their main caregiver, which tends to be their mother. There are also lack of facilities across the world for women in prison. In Sierra Leone, we have 2 prisons for women, but even those prisons lack some of the necessary facilities that women may require, such as healthcare or facilities for children. Studies have shown that women's mental health significantly deteriorates in prison, and suicide and self-harm are also a concern. In Tunisia, 40% of women in prison interviewed had either harmed themselves or attempted suicide. And we know that stigma influences women in prison much more than men. Many women who are released from prison have challenges finding employment or are rejected by their families. But non-custodial measures have many benefits. They can reduce the social impact of imprisonment on women and indeed society. They can reduce the economic costs for governments. They are often much cheaper than imprisonment. They can reduce the prison population. And we know with the COVID pandemic that overcrowding is very hazardous. And studies have shown, and I will reflect on some of these later, that they also reduce reoffending rates. And non-custodial measures can better address the needs of women than imprisonment, particularly if gender-appropriate services are incorporated. And one of the challenges we see is that non-custodial measures are often implemented the same way for men and women, and they don't take into account the particular needs of women. And so really when designing programs, it's really important to be looking at the particular needs of women in that community. So I'll briefly go over some international standards, although I appreciate these have been talked about earlier on. Of course, the Tokyo rules 30 years ago encouraged states to use non-custodial measures and stated that pretrial detention should be a measure of last resort. And 10 years ago, we had the Bangkok rules, which provided a gender-responsive perspective on the standards for treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures. So Rule 57 states that gender-specific alternatives to imprisonment should be developed, so it gives this mandate to countries. Rule 58 provides that women should not be separated from their families and communities without due consideration to their background and family ties. So that rule is stating that alternatives should be preferred. Rule 60 states that appropriate resources should be made available to develop suitable alternatives, such as counselling, mental health support, or educational programs. And these should take into account the need to provide childcare or women-only services. And Rule 62 provides that substance abuse treatment programs in the community should be provided, and these should be gender sensitive and trauma informed, and perhaps women only. And my colleague who will speak later around drug offences may delve into this further. I'm going to briefly go over some gender-responsive alternatives to pretrial detention. A key one is firstly decriminalization or depenalization. So many women are arrested for petty offences, so minor offences or low-level drug crimes, and many countries have moved to decriminalize them. So recently this happened in Malawi when the High Court held that the petty offence of being a rogue or a vagabond was unconstitutional. And this just means that many women are not going to be arrested for these offences. So it's a very positive. Secondly, diversion, which I know we've talked about with children, and this is very positive for women because it means that they're completely diverted away from the criminal justice system and can instead receive community support or treatment. In the UK, women's centres work with the police and they help to divert women arrested for low-level offences, and they divert them to relevant treatment programmes. And studies have found that the reoffending rate was 30%. Sorry, I think I'll speak more slowly. And a study found that the reoffending rate was 30% compared to 35% for a group of similar women who did not receive such support. So these women's centres are a good practice example. But even for more low-income countries like Sierra Leone, diversion is something that can be put into practice. So in Sierra Leone, we see many women who are arrested for owing money, particularly market women who are working in the informal economy. But because of years of work and building up trust in relationships with the police will refer these debt cases to Advocate, and our paralegals will help to mediate them to make sure the women can have a payback plan, which is much more positive instead of them being in prison. As we know, pretrial detention should be a measure of last resort, but many women have difficulties accessing bail. And so it's very important when looking at bail conditions that these actually take into account a woman's background. For example, she may not be able to report to the court if she has a childcare obligation. So countries have tried to find solutions. For example, maybe the probation officer goes to her house, which makes it much easier for her to fulfill this requirement. In Sierra Leone, advocates, paralegals monitor police stations, and they're able to provide legal advice to women who are arrested and make sure that they can support them with the bail process, even go to the families and try and find a surety. And many countries such as Australia or Malawi have similar paralegal programs, which have been very helpful in increasing women's access to bail. And house arrest is another alternative to pretrial detention. In Brazil, in 2018, the Supreme Court ruled that pregnant women and mothers of children under 12 can be placed under house arrest instead of pretrial detention. Whilst this is positive, it's also important to make sure that gender-responsive considerations are taken into account. For example, if a woman is under house arrest, she may still have childcare obligations, such as taking her children to school. and she may be in a situation where she encounters gender-based violence. So all of these factors need to be taken into account. And with all of the alternative measures, it's really important to make sure the least interventionist measure is the one put into place. So looking at a measure that's much more empowering for a woman, such as perhaps being referred to a community centre, which can deal with some of the underlying factors that lead to her coming into contact with the law, rather than imposing, instead of imprisonment, another form of imprisonment, such as through house arrest. I'll just briefly also touch on non-custodial sentences. And I'm very aware that the Kingdom of Bahrain has made some very positive moves in this regard. And in fact, this was one of the promising practices that we included in the UN ODC toolkit. The first thing, of course, is it's very important to remove mandatory sentences. And the Bangkok rules call on states to do this so that alternatives can be considered, and so that gender-responsive mitigating factors can also be considered when looking at a sentence. For example, whether a woman has encountered abuse or whether she has childcare obligations. Suspended sentences and deferred sentences are often used for women who are pregnant or who have children, and these are very positive, particularly if they go in hand with some gender-responsive assistance programs. Deferred sentences are preferable because it means that a woman can avoid having a criminal record. And we see many countries use these, from South Africa to Russia to Georgia. A community-based treatment order is where a woman can, instead of receiving imprisonment, can actually receive treatment in the community. And a good example is in the US with Justice Home, where instead of going to prison, women can remain at home with their families and get individualized support from a caseworker and access drug treatment, mental health services, and parenting and life skills. And many formerly incarcerated women work in this program, which helps because they understand the challenges that a woman is going through. It's less expensive than imprisonment, and results have shown that this sort of program greatly reduces recidivism rates. Another option, of course, is community service. And in Kenya, there was a gender-responsive pilot program where community service was implemented, really taking into account the needs of women. So, for example, the placement made sure it was close to home, so the women did not have very far to travel. Consideration was made about their safety, so making sure they were not traveling at night or at long distances. It took into consideration their childcare obligations, and it made sure not to gender stereotype. So making sure the type of community service they were given was something that could empower the women, not just something which we traditionally think women should be doing. And the probation officers were also provided training on the Bangkok rules. And after receiving this training, they were far more likely to recommend a community service option than if they hadn't received this training. And of course, if a woman is sentenced to imprisonment, it's really important to make sure that provisions for early release are provided, such as parole, pardon, or re-entry programs. So thank you very much. This is the toolkit I referred to that was produced by UNODC, and there is a link to it, and it has a lot more information and more examples. And very happy to also talk further during the question and answer session. Thank you again.